This presentation will look at Barak Rosenshine's principles of instruction as they're applied to psychology teaching. The reference for you to look at this further is at the bottom of the slide. So Rosenshine's instructional principles are very firmly grounded in research. So three areas that have been looked at: cognitive science, so how our brains process information; the classroom practice of effective, or as Rosenshine calls them, master teachers; and cognitive support, strategies and techniques that assist student learning. Now, there are 10 principles, but it wouldn't be possible or even desirable to use all 10 principles in every single lesson, because after all, lessons really are a series of linked learning opportunities rather than discrete entities. So these principles are things that good teachers will use, but not necessarily all at the same time. So the 10 principles that we're going to look at today: begin each lesson with a short review, present new information in steps and allow opportunity for student practice, question all students, provide models, guide practice, check understanding, obtain a high success rate before continuing, that's after you've checked understanding, scaffold difficult tasks, set independent work and monitor to ensure completion, and finally engage in weekly and monthly reviews. So, beginning each lesson with a short review. Research has shown that teachers who began each of their lessons with an 8-minute review had students who consistently scored higher in achievement scores compared to a group of teachers who didn't do this. When we think about it from a psychological perspective and our ideas of memory, we can see that this would work because it's reinforcing, it's allowing students to rehearse and transfer information into their long-term memory and keep rehearsing it so that it becomes a solid memory. Presenting new information in steps and allowing opportunity for student practice. This links in very much with cognitive load theory. The idea that intrinsic cognitive load is the relative difficulty or complexity of what you're asking your students to learn. And of course, teaching new concepts or ideas will always lead to a relatively high level of intrinsic cognitive load. So one of the things that we know from cognitive load theory is that short-term memory has a limited capacity. Miller's Magic 7 suggests that it's around about 5 or 9 items, 7 plus or minus 2. So when you're planning, think carefully about the amount of new information you'll be presenting in a lesson and try to limit it between 5 and 9 chunks of information and break it down into easy steps. Allowing opportunity for practice. In psychology, the best way to do this is through active learning techniques. So wherever possible, do lots of mini practicals. Recreate the research that you're teaching. As the Chinese proverb says, I listen and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So those active learning techniques are really, really important. Question all students. Now the key here is all. It's not good practice to rely on hands up because actually the same few students will offer an answer and the other students engage in a bit of social loafing. They know somebody else will answer, so they don't have to worry about it. One of the ways that you can get around that is to use a randomised method, so choosing students at random so they're on their toes, they know they could be asked at any time. Keeping a tally of which students have answered questions and then target those that haven't answered or volunteered an answer. Use prior knowledge of student ability though to ensure that you target questions to the appropriate students. So it can sometimes be really intimidating for a student that's weaker to be worried that they're going to be asked a question they've got no chance of answering. So be sensitive to that. You might want to think about bronze, silver and gold questions that represent increasing levels of challenge. You could even ask your students, do you want a bronze, a silver or a gold question today? Once they get used to that, they'll respond to that quite well. Another way to involve all students is to use think, pair, share and think about your seating plan so that students have got maybe a higher achieving student with a lower achieving student, but then be careful that the lower achieving one doesn't just rely on the higher achieving one to give the answers all the time. There's lots of work by Black and William that will help on this, on questioning. Provide models. So students really like model examination answers. You'll find them on all the major awarding body websites. But one of the issues is they like them, but do they actually read them, or do they just file them away and never look at them again? So one thing that you can do to make sure that they interact with these model answers is by making them into a close activity, removing keywords. And you can differentiate this by either giving them the missing words or not giving them. But the point is they've got to read it and they've got to make a decision. Another thing you could do would be to ask students to highlight different sections of the answer. So it might be all the descriptive material, assessment objective 1, or the evaluation, assessment objective 3, or the application, assessment objective 2, depending on what you were trying to teach them from this model answer and what you wanted them to improve on. Or it might be all the specialist terminology that they've used. But it's vital that they interact with those models in some way. Checking understanding. So how do we know students have learnt what we actually wanted them to learn? An ineffective teacher might have a plenary where they go, are there any questions at the end of the lesson? And assume that if there are no questions, everyone understands the content of the lesson, where actually it might just be that it's break time and everyone just wants to get off to their break quite quickly. So students need targeted questions that check for understanding throughout the lesson. So an effective teacher uses this feedback to assess the student's level of knowledge and understanding and gauge whether the new information has been successfully transferred into long-term memory. One of the things when we're checking understanding is we need to obtain quite a high success rate before we continue. One thing we can think about here is threshold concepts. So a threshold concept can be considered as akin to a portal, opening up new and previously inaccessible ways of thinking about something. It represents a transformed way of understanding or interpreting or viewing something without which the learner cannot progress. Mayer and Land, 2003. So a threshold concept has the following features. They're transformative. Once a student gets it, it changes the way they think about a subject. They're troublesome. So in other words, they're quite difficult. Sometimes a student might find it really hard to get to grips with it, yet once they understand it, it becomes easy and straightforward and intuitive. I know when I first started to study psychology, I found it really difficult to get into my head the difference between the IV and the DV. And obviously that's a threshold concept in psychology, but once you've got it, you almost can't understand why you didn't get it in the first place. But until you've understood that, you're never going to be able to progress to write a hypothesis. So it's irreversible. So once you've learnt it, you can't unlearn it. So I'll never forget now what an IV and a DV is. It's ingrained in my head. It's integrative. So it unifies parts of the subject. So it might completely shift the view that the student has towards the subject. It might be an underlying theme that opens everything up for them. So unless students have a firm grasp of threshold concepts, they will be unable to progress with their learning. So any misunderstandings need to be identified, and then they must be rectified by the teacher. Now, it might be appropriate to do that at a whole class level. You might, for example, take in some work to mark an assessment and find out that none of your students understand something. At that point, it's obvious that you're going to have to go back and reteach that. Or it might be just an individual level or a small group. It might be just a few students need a little bit of extra attention on that. So some of the examples of things that can be threshold concepts in psychology, as I've already mentioned, IVs and DVs, writing hypotheses, probability levels. If they don't understand those, it's really difficult to understand inferential statistics. Ethics underpins everything, and lots of research methods really I would class as a threshold concept. So, guiding practice and scaffolding difficult tasks. So the social aspect of learning involves the teacher supporting and guiding the student until they've gained the knowledge or skills being taught. So Vygotsky talked about the zone of proximal development as the difference between what a learner can do without help and what he or she can do with help. And he suggests that teachers use cooperative learning exercises where less competent students develop with help from more skillful peers within that zone of proximal development. So scaffolding is a term which describes that sort of help, which might be from a teacher or a more advanced peer. So one way that we can scaffold is to provide writing frames for extended writing tasks. Now, the problem that many teachers have is that they fail to remove the scaffolding, and students then find it difficult to think for themselves. So scaffolding should be removed gradually to build up student confidence, so that early in their course of study, writing plans contain a lot of detail, and that level of detail is gradually reduced until students no longer need a writing frame. Set independent work and monitor to ensure completion. Obvious one, but think outside of the box. Homework doesn't have to be exam questions, and sometimes exam questions aren't that useful as homework because good students will spend far too long on exam questions, something that they couldn't possibly replicate in an exam condition, and weaker students will just copy passages out of the textbook. So think outside of the box and work smarter, not harder. So think of things that are easy for you to check that they've done, but don't create lots of marking. So online self-checking tasks are brilliant for this. Poster tasks. More and more universities now are getting students to do poster tasks as part of their learning. As long as the task is meaningful for students and effective at reinforcing their learning, then it's tick the box. Engage in weekly and monthly review. So don't leave revision until the end of the course. Review regularly. Remember what we know from memory research, little and often. End of topic tests, low stakes weekly quizzes. Another thing that I like to use with students is personal learning checklists. Basically, these are almost the bullet points from your specification, and then students just tick through whether they're red, amber or green. Red means they've got no idea and need to do lots of work on it. Amber means they're okay-ish but could do with a quick review, and green means that they're confident with that. So, to conclude then, Rosenshine's 10 instructional principles are really useful for us as psychologists. There's nothing new or unusual there. All of those things are things that most of us do anyway, but sometimes it's just useful to remind ourselves. Thank you for listening.